Good morning to those of you on the East Coast of the US, and good afternoon to those of you in Europe. I'm Kori, and I lead the Foreign and Defense Policy team at the American Enterprise Institute. And it's my great pleasure this morning to moderate an extraordinary panel exploring issues of gray zone warfare and an outstanding new book called The Defender's Dilemma. Aggression in the gray zone between war and peace is a daily challenge facing Western countries. And while disinformation and cyberattacks are well-known forms of gray zone aggression, other more subtle forms, including corporate coercion, gradual border changes, and subversive business practices, do equally serious damage. How can free societies counter the nefarious effects of gray zone warfare, especially when so much of it resembles the bustle of everyday life? And to explore these questions, we have an outstanding panel of experts. Jānis Garasons, the State Secretary in the Ministry of Defense of Latvia. Giedrimas Jeglinskas, the Assistant Secretary General for Executive Management at NATO. Mark Montgomery, the Executive Director of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at AEI and the author of Defender's Dilemma. Elisabeth, let's start with you. What are the most important things you think people should take away from your outstanding new book? Elisabeth, you are muted.
Kori, and thank you, Jānis, Giedrimas, and Mark, for joining Kori and me on this discussion. What people should take away is that they shouldn't stare themselves blind at the threat of war. Obviously, at the moment, there is a very serious war going on, and we hope it will end soon. It doesn't seem very likely. But even as we focus on that, and indeed on any other day and in any other part of the world, we should pay attention to the aggression that happens below the threshold of armed violence, because it too weakens our societies in less perceptible ways, but it can, for example, take away our ability to distinguish truth from fiction. It can take away our economic advantage, which is based on innovation, on our companies performing well and generating wealth for their countries. And it can also take away more practical things like power and the internet. And these are really fundamental issues in our Western societies, and yet they are always at risk and often under aggression or being attacked with these forms of aggression that you just mentioned, Kori. So these are not abstract considerations. These are things that are happening every single day in our countries. And the most important thing is that we don't have a strategy for defense of our countries against these forms of aggression, simply because they are much harder to spot, and it's in fact hard to decide when something is beginning to happen, and when you finally spot it, it may be too late.
Mm-hmm. Jānis, given how supportive the Republic of Latvia has been of Ukraine, I'd like to start our discussion of Ukraine by asking you what's taking place in the gray zone now and before the invasion.
Well, I think first of all, good afternoon those who are in Europe, and good morning those who are in the United States. First of all, I think this what we have to go back to probably so-called General Gerasimov's doctrine on modern, so-called modern Russian warfare, which actually brings us includes from everything what's going on in the gray zone up to the conventional and nuclear strike. And I think that is what been happening, but we ignored, I think, many of those things because Russians have been telling very openly that they regard themselves in war with the West. West ignore it. I think we pretended that it's not it's not being said. It's not the case. But de facto, what did it mean that Russians did and still are doing many things against us and against Ukraine? And those things in gray zone, what we don't normally see, but what meant to play on very primitive, sometimes on very sensitive feelings, and to spread half true, half or even lies. And to play on those most sensitive things like immigration or many other things, and spread. Basically, the aim is to divide us, to spread fear, and affect our brains. What happened in Ukraine, I think the first time, I would say, United States played back. And I think it was very successful operation. I would say when this gray zone play finishes, when you start, when you give the animal the name, or when you give animal the name, when you name basically in the real name, and then it stops. And I think I really give credit because this is the first time when United States gave the name to Russian operation, which was, I think, very complex operation, how to start the war with Ukraine. And it didn't happen, and then it ended when I would say now as historian, it ended in 1940 the same way as Soviet Union started war with Finland, or Nazi Germany started war against Poland with very brutal lies. And many other things. Therefore, I think the gray zone works until we are afraid to give the name.
Thank you. Giedrimas, one of the most extraordinary things about the gray zone warfare in the run-up to the physical warfare in Ukraine has been the remarkable solidarity of the NATO countries. What's NATO doing right that we can understand and apply to this problem in the future?
Well, thank you, Kori, again, first for having me here. And I just want to say it was obviously a pleasure to work with Elisabeth contribute very minorly to this to her effort here in this book, but also throughout many years that we sort of communicated and interacted, and it's. I'm back, I think. Sorry, and of course, I know Yanis as well from prior roles. So again, it's great to be here. Now, in terms of your question, I just wanted also to kind of also bandwagon to what Yanis has said, is that I think the Gerasimov's, the sort of feared Gerasimov doctrine that he has, that basically employing all the tools of possible all the tools available really to wage war, or doing a pre-war using sort of gray line deterrence or gray line aggression. I think what we've seen that actually in Ukraine, and I think when I'll go back and I'll go to the question that Kori posed about the unity of NATO, is that really Russia has not been able to destroy the will to fight, and has not been able to destroy the whole society, really. I think and I think researchers will look at it for years to come. What happened there? What sort of, whether there was failure from Russians, or whether there was some sort of a inability to see that as sort of unity within the Ukraine willingness to fight. And I think that willingness to fight has been, of course, in a presence also in a person of President Zelensky, who's been nothing but inspiring and incredibly just the leader really man of the century, as my friend Julian Lindley's friend just wrote me. Really, the guy who's sort of inspiring both his nation to fight, but also the West. And I think that unity, and I just came out of we have a defense ministerial as we speak now at the NATO headquarters, and one of the Lloyd Austin's messages is unity is paramount. This is his first message, and I think we've been able to do that because I think also speaking of the gray zone deterrence efforts, I think that looking at the informational space, I think we've been able to win it on our side, at least. It seems like it's a bifurcation happening in the information space. So yes, perhaps Putin is truly poisoning the minds of Russians there, and we're hardly able to access them because of all these technological sort of restrictions. But on the West side, here on our side, I think we're very united because the message has been clear both from Ukraine. We're seeing the media unite, whether it's Fox News or CNN. It's we have a unity factor here, and I think it's the same as with with cyber. I think Russia has been able to. They're doing things, but again, given this is a kinetic war now, and people are focused on actual destruction, and we are focused on actual human suffering. This is not just a pure kind of cyber attack that you lose electricity for a day or so. This is truly life-altering events that are happening on the ground, and I think that's just I think this is all of that, a combination probably of that, really creates that unity that it's sort of unparalleled, almost unprecedented in our society, at least in the past several years, as we've seen. All our societies have been broken apart through COVID, all the polarization that took place there. But so I'll stop there. I'm sorry.
Thank you. That's great. Mark Montgomery, can I ask you to assess the Russian campaign? How do you think they did in the gray zone? Could they have achieved their objectives without crossing into kinetic war? What does this look like for you?
Thanks, Kori and Elisabeth. Thanks for having me here, and Elisabeth, thanks for letting me contribute in your book. I think that's interesting. I tend to fall more on this is an example of Russian failure, not as much European, U.S., NATO success. Not that we haven't been successful, but I think the driving issue here is that Russia really surprised us. I mean, they have been conducting effective gray zone warfare against Ukraine, Europe, and the United States for the last 8 years. They have kept Ukraine was nowhere near signing off chapters to get into EU. And Russia had a lot to do with that. They undermined them economically, undermined their foreign direct investment. They were very aggressive in doing this. They were very successful in keeping Ukraine out of NATO. I mean, first of all, you always have Hungary to vote no. But in addition, Germany wasn't going to vote yes on this a year ago, 6 months ago. I mean, Russia was using economic warfare, gray zone tactics to keep them out, and they were successful. There was not a big movement. So they were winning. The question is, what happened to Putin's patience and persistence on this? I mean, authoritarian regimes are good at gray zone warfare because unlike democracies, they don't have to be responsive to public opinion of the moment, the crisis of the day. They can be persistent and deliberate and undermine their adversary. But when he punched across the border, in three different directions, and turned this into a kinetic war, he really undermined his own disinformation. I mean, it's funny, you watch that Russian kind of blockhead general, looks like Drago from the Rocky group, gets on TV every day. I watch it for humor, not for anything else. And I don't think the Russians are convincing anyone. I don't think Lavrov has any credibility when he speaks. And, so they've undermined their own gray zone capability in the future with this effort, frankly. And so I think it's interesting. I think the why he lost persistence or patience is only something Putin can answer. I doubt Gerasimov or any of his generals can answer it because it didn't look like they were prepared for war. So my guess is they lost persistence and patience. They lost their advantage in the gray zone. And as a result, this is no longer a gray zone competition from Russia's perspective.
Elisabeth, I'd like to ask you to weigh in on this, and in particular, to talk about what have the Ukrainians done right? how have they appear to be enormously successful in the gray zone. What are they doing right that the rest of us ought to take as models?
Thank you, Kori. The irony, I think, is that, as Mark said, had this invasion not happened, Russia would have been quite successful, and Ukraine would have suffered, not as badly as it's suffering now, but Russia could have kept going. And it's interesting, I think, if you consider the reaction of FDI investors, international money markets, when those around 190,000 soldiers arrived at the border or were assembled at the border. That frightened FDI investors, frightened international money markets. The cost of insuring against sovereign default of Ukraine rose, and so the Ukrainian economy suffered even more than it had suffered before, and there was nothing Ukraine really could do about it. Because international investors, no investors have any obligation to any country. They invest where they think there's opportunity. And Ukraine was already a country where you needed a high risk appetite to invest. Well, that high risk appetite was then challenged further. And even those high risk appetite investors got nervous and left. And same thing goes for shipping when Russia in this situation conducted naval exercises in the Black Sea. Global insurers said, well, this is looking risky. We'll put the Black Sea, the Russian and Ukrainian parts of the Black Sea in our highest risk category, which means that global shipping companies struggled to get insurance to sail to Russian and Ukrainian ports, and Ukraine obviously has no other ports. So it would have been, as Mark said, in Russia's interest to keep it there. It didn't. And what then happened is that Ukraine turned out to have the same quality that the Finns did in 1939, between the 30th of November 1939 and the 13th of March 1940, when they defied the Red Army, not through massive improvements in military capability. They were as inferior as the Soviets had expected militarily, but through massive amounts of societal resilience and motivation, where they made the best out of that, of what they did have, both in the armed forces and society-wide, where really the whole of society turned up and did its part to sustain the armed forces. And we're seeing, I think, something similar in Ukraine, and their information operation or their messaging to the world clearly is superior to what the Russians are putting out, surprisingly so.
So I want to press you a little bit to be more specific. What are in addition to the enormous lion-hearted willingness to defend their society, what specifically are they doing that the rest of us should be picking up as best practices, Elisabeth?
I think it really is involving all parts of society. The challenge that we have in the West is that we put enormous belief and trust in the armed forces, and our armed forces are superior, especially in the United States. But that, in a sense, gives everybody a sort of an alibi for not being involved, and that's what we should learn from the Ukrainians and from the Finns during the Winter War. There is a role for everybody, even if it's a very minor role. For example, check information before you share it, and that's something that I think every single person could take from this war in Ukraine, that you need to check information before sharing it, because there is so much disinformation, misinformation, hyperbole floating around, and it helps nobody if we create an environment where the information floating around or going around can't be trusted, can't be assumed to be true.
So, Yanis, I'd like to come back to you, because Latvia in particular has experience with a brutal form of gray zone warfare. That is the precedent of the so-called refugee crisis from Belarus, where the government was attempting to weaponize their own citizens in a refugee flow to destabilize or penalize surrounding countries. How did Latvia handle this, and what are the lessons the rest of us should take?
Well, I think the first thing is to name the problem or the event or the process as it should be named. And I think that was first what we did. We said that it's not a refugee crisis as it was presented by Lukashenko, but it is migration organized by one illegal and suppressive regime, which at that point thought that he might basically gain some benefits from these kind of disagreements, because I think the idea was generally not very. It was a good idea because they thought that they might play on differences between different perceptions in Europe, because there is still perception of this need to accept any refugee, and there is of course different approaches to that, and then you start playing with those differences, and you basically create dividing lines in Europe. Now that was a very simple idea, but of course, as I think all countries, what this action was turned against, we are not with rosy glasses. We know what to expect from our neighbor, and we named it as it is, and we didn't allow to start this kind of conversation, and that stopped immediately, and that I think that's generally, now we're looking what happens in Belarus. Basically, we don't need to listen to I think to Lukashenko, and neither I think to Lavrov or any other authorities, because they say one day they say one thing, another day they say completely other thing, and then again it's like a very famous fairy tale with different kind of characters there. But I think we simply have to be very real and understand the real reasons behind those actions, and then we, but I want to go back to Elisabeth's point on where Ukraine was better. Ukrainians are preparing to fight the war. And that, I think, that what changed in all these events, it was the will of Ukrainian people to fight Russians. Because however we can send our emissaries and we can try to negotiate everything what we want. And we can send to Mr. Putin whomever we want. Unless Ukrainians are not ready to surrender, nobody can negotiate on behalf of them. And I think that was the biggest difference, as the Finns did in 1940, because they fought contrary to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Gerbiamas, NATO's famous Article 5 says that an armed attack on one NATO member shall be considered an attack on them all. And yet, gray zone warfare might not be considered an armed attack, but it's unquestionably a form of attack. Can you give us a sense about how the alliance is wrestling with this issue of thresholds of attacks that we respond to?
Absolutely, a question that's that probably has we need to think a lot about, and there's no clear answers at this point. But I think there's some things that have moved in the past several years. Broadly speaking, the one thing is that the whole expansion of the so-called military or conflict domain. So we go from kind of pure military, so traditional military domains such as air, maritime, and land by adding, for example, cyber domain, which it already, I think, increases the spectrum of thoughts and possibilities of what can happen as adversaries, sort of as we deal with adversaries. I think by adding space domain, it adds another complexity, because again, space is somewhere up there and sort of owned by nobody, and it does increase sort of the complexity. Now in cyber domain, again, there's no clear cut.
Well, mid-sentence, we appear to have lost the NATO Assistant Secretary General. I hope we will get his connection back in just a second. And I also hope that it's a mechanical failure and not proof of the gray zone warfare of our adversaries. Until we get him back, please. Mark Montgomery, can I add? Kijimas,
I don't know what happened. I'm sorry. The technology, 2 years in the pandemic, we're still sometimes. Apologies.
No, I was just saying, I hope that it's a technical problem and not gray zone warfare by our adversaries. So please continue, my friend.
Yeah. So just to quickly to wrap up this question, I just think one thing about a cyber domain and whether a cyber attack can be considered part of like Article 5 considerations. I think yes. The broad answer is yes. The short answer is yes. Of course, nothing has been played out. Nothing. We need to have scenarios. We need to have a proper, I think, proper sort of planning to really understand what that even entails, as has been communicated by the leadership of the alliance. So it's sort of a unknown sphere, but the whole thinking is progressing, and as we kind of go deeper into space technologies and the competition in space in the global in this sort of geostrategic competition environment, I think that these things will need to evolve. But again, at this point, it's again a lot of discussions, but obviously no clear cut answers.
Sure, Mark. What should the threshold be? How do free societies best band together to protect ourselves from the openness of our societies being used as a vulnerability?
So we looked at this pretty hard in the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and trying to think about what constitutes an attack is very hard in the cyber domain. And you can't take kind of the traditional deterrence theory from nuclear. That comes from nuclear power, because the idea, pretty much one nuclear weapon's enough to trip, your deterrence doctrine, whereas clearly one cyber attack's not enough to trip your deterrence doctrine. So trying to figure out how do you operate below the use of force. I agree with Gidrimas. I've been a little disappointed at the speed with which NATO's thought about the integration of cyber into warfare. I think they've done a good job over the last 3 years, thinking about how cyber is part of kinetic warfare, and they're building that into their planning and such. And I see real improvements there. Where it hasn't probably done as much as they would like or outsiders would like is in the identification of what does a cyber independent attack look like? How does it kick off different responses? What is the threshold that an attack would cause a response? What we noticed in the United States and what caused our commission to get created was Senator McCain tired of finding that almost anything the adversary did was below our threshold of the use of force in a response. This includes China stealing 24 million, records from OPM. It includes North Korea's attack on Sony. It includes Iranian distributed denial of service attacks on our banks, and probably most explicitly, the Russian cyber-enabled IO against our election system in 2016. And so when everything your adversary does is below your use of force marker, you probably have set your threshold too high, and you haven't established the conditions where an adversary feels the punishment or the cost imposition of your response in non-military terms, whether it's economic, law enforcement, or cyber. If I could comment on one other thing on the Belarus case, most of us thought Lukashenko was kind of running the group of bumbling idiots. I mean, he couldn't even fix an election, right? That's like Sovietology 101, get at least 90% in the next election. He couldn't do it. But suddenly last fall, he was brilliant. I mean, exporting these, Syrians, Afghans, Iraqi Kurds, setting up travel agencies in their localities, giving them cheap flights to Belarus, and then not feeding them, transporting them to the border and trying to stuff them across, it really introduced challenges into Poland and the Baltic states. And it was undermining kind of how Western Europe looked at Eastern Europe. I mean, it was absolutely beautifully executed gray zone warfare. And it really causes you to wonder how this group of people can be so good in one aspect. And then, 3 months later in February, so poorly, because I'm going to assume the Russians helped the Belarus in that event, and then so poorly misjudged things in Ukraine. But, that Belarus, that's the gray zone warfare we'd come to know and respect, from the Russians and the Chinese over the last 5 years, not what we saw, on February 24th when ground forces entered Ukraine.
So, Elisabeth, before I ask you to share your perspective, I want to tell our listeners that if you have questions for us, please submit them to Leila Hanande at AEI.org. It's spelled out on the screen for you, my friends, or on Twitter with the hashtag Grayzone AEI. So, Elisabeth, how do you think about what the threshold should be for response, either by individual free societies or by the groupings of us in the European Union, in NATO? What should it be, do you think? What should we be working towards?
I have been inclined to think that it should be loss of life, which is clearly identifiable. If we lose people's lives on our side, then we should respond, or more accurately, we should signal to our adversaries that if there is loss of life on our side, we will respond. Of course, that leaves the question of what to do, for example, about gradual territorial gains. For example, what Russia has been doing in the so-called borderization of Georgia, or what China did with those artificial islands, where at no point was it obvious enough or blatant enough for anybody to respond properly, and now the islands are there and they are not going away. So I think the easiest answer is to signal that if there is loss of life on our side as a result of adversary aggression in the gray zone, we will respond. But I still haven't figured out what to do about other really quite significant but gradual forms of aggression, including.
I was just going to press you on that, because the Belarus so-called refugee crisis falls below your standard. So does that mean there shouldn't have been collective action, both to assist the states? How should we have handled that?
It is incredibly complex, and I think it's worth remembering that deterrence comes in two forms: of deterrence by denial, deterrence by punishment. And maybe this is if the form of aggression is weaponization of refugees, maybe the form of deterrence we should focus on is deterrence by denial. So deny the other side, in this case Lukashenko, the opportunity to weaken our societies by weaponizing human beings. And that's in a sense what Latvia did, and Lithuania and Poland. They took some heat from the European Union for their tough stance and the fact that they really closed their borders. But in doing so, they denied Lukashenko the opportunity to achieve what he wanted to achieve, which was to get all these people across, cause chaos, not just in these countries, but in the European Union more widely, and also cause resentment and division among EU member states on this very thorny issue of migration.
Mark, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this as well.
Thanks. I agree broadly with Elisabeth. I'd say this is one of those areas where it's interesting, where NATO is a fantastic organization, EU is a great organization. Neither one of them has the agility necessary to compete with Russian disinformation, but that's okay. They have the membership and they have the relationships you build in there. And so, what we need to have is either U.S. or European-led coalition of the willing to respond to things. So in the case of this, the Baltic states got together to respond. But in general, when the Russians or the Chinese or the Belarus, any of their acolytes do things in the gray zone, you have to find what's that minimum group of people that can take significant action, but it's big enough it can take significant action, but small enough a group that you can do it agilely and rapidly. Neither NATO or EU lend themselves to that kind of decision making, except in the most egregious examples by the adversary. So what you need are the coalitions of the willing. I think you saw it develop there. I think you saw this more and more. It's happening right now in Eastern Europe. NATO is not sending air defense weapons to Poland. The United States is sending air defense weapons to Poland. Germany is sending air defense weapons to Slovakia. In fact, I would say shame on Norway, the Dutch, the Spanish, who have NASAM systems, and on the French and Italians who have SAM-T. All those systems, several of them should be flowing to Poland to protect the logistics sites that where we're putting humanitarian and military efforts. But that coalition of the willing right now could only be the U.S. and Germany, and so the two of us sent our stuff. That's how that's how we respond to this: is to rapidly form small groups of countries who can do something significant and are willing to do it now.
Gedrimas, how does that variable geometry work for NATO headquarters? Is that a threat to unity of the alliance? Is it a way to lead turn action that then the rest of allies can either catch up to, or, as Mark just demonstrated, be shamed into? What's the perspective from the headquarters on Mark's solution?
Yeah, I think I agree with Mark that it's probably the most the agility of the organization. It's natural that large organization, especially very complex organization. Although I wouldn't say that NATO is a very large organization, but it has 30 members. It has a very complex decision making, which is based on consensus. So we always look for a consensus. So essentially, oftentimes at the end of the day, you get to a sort of lowest accepted common denominator, and that sort of that solution oftentimes doesn't satisfy anybody. Sort of everybody's equally unhappy. Hopefully, you hope for that. So I think in these sort of scenarios, whether that's this crisis called refugee crisis from Belarus, again, I think this very much falls. The onus falls on the country or several nations raising this issue very convincingly, and this is what happened. I think in Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. I think, with being myself Lithuanian, again, I'm not part of the government currently, but I think that the governments did a really great job communicating this and really ensuring that we get that unity at the European Union level and at the NATO level. I remember actually going there, visiting. We were visiting with Secretary General as well as Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the Commission, going on the same plane, going into Vilnius, meeting the president, showing unity that EU and NATO actually are together with this. Again, that's I think the work that has been done really by Latvia, Lithuania, and the Polish authorities that to raise that. Now, speaking of that, for example, in the current Ukraine, aspect, the war, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, I think again, NATO is very complex. The position is very clear. I think we're always looking for a leader. Although the 30 nations have equal votes, we know which nation has the most capability, and which nation can actually provide the most capability. Yes, U.S. is the leader in that in defense investment, in the sort of military capability, and we'll look for that. And I think in that sense, President Zelensky is doing the right thing. He just had a whole call with the Congress. That's the right way to go. But you start somewhere. And of course, the best is to start with a leader of the alliance, with the United States. And I think as this progresses, I think then other nations may sort of fall into the line. But that's how it works in the complex organization.
Thank you. Yanis, I'd like to hear your perspective on that, but I'd also like to direct the first of the questions coming from our listeners towards you, because I think the Baltic states in particular have answers to teach the rest of us. So the question is, have Western democracies lost their way in building or sustaining a whole of society response to toxic, hostile, or divisive behavior by peer adversaries? Is the polarization of our politics into tribal forms of populism a crucial factor for anti-democrats in Beijing, Moscow, or elsewhere to benefit from our inability to work across the aisle for national interest?
Well, yes, I actually wanted to respond to those questions. Yes, to some extent we lost this agility, and therefore we already some years ago we decided to develop comprehensive defense or total defense, which actually is meant to develop this resilience, because people have to understand and have to be aware of those threats. If you don't talk to people about threats, and people believe that they are not threatened, and the best way how to appease Putin is trade with him. Then it's fine. You should not expect that your society will support or believe in any kind of threats. That is, it will not develop resilience, because again, going back to threshold. Threshold is always depends on different factors, but the most important is resilience of your society. Because in the Baltics, Russians have been meddling in our elections since 90s. In US, it happened once, and it suddenly was, how it's happening, why it's happening, and it's whoa. For us, it's nothing we can deal with that, and therefore I think what is important to talk to societies and not to let them live with rosy glasses. And I think what happened for last 2 decades, especially in Europe, our people were told that everything is fine. We can live without worries. We don't need armies, and that is, I think, what's happening now. But we finally have to say to our societies, we have to have armies, and we will have to fight for our freedom. If not, sorry to say, at one point Russia and China will dominate, and I think we have to be very, very open with that.
Elisabeth, may I ask you to thank you, Yanis. Elisabeth, may I ask you to also weigh in on this issue of polarization of politics assisting our adversaries?
Yes, and just a quick point first to say that Yanis and his department and the wider Latvian government are doing fantastic work, for example, with the resilience training for teenagers. And 2 years ago, when they started it may have seemed a little bit maybe unnecessary, and then it became completely obvious that all parts of our society have to be prepared for crises, and these can be obviously anything starting with innovation, but especially in the gray zone. And the point is not to I think that the challenge that Western governments face is they worry about causing panic, and they don't want to worry people. They don't want to worry their voters. But if you're not straight with your population, with the public, about the risks facing our societies, they will panic when a crisis strikes. And it can be something like Colonial Pipeline here in the US, which occurred and caused people to say, well, I better fill up my car so that I at least get gasoline. And then they forgot that everybody else was doing the same thing. And so the original ransomware attack, and I'm sure Mark can talk more about this, but the original ransomware attack against Colonial Pipeline caused significant damage, but people's reaction to it caused even more damage. So the point is, I think, to be open with the public, with ordinary citizens, and with the private sector about the risks facing them, on a private sector note, companies are already aware of these risks. There is a fantastic new survey by Willis Towers Watson, global insurance broker. 56% of companies they surveyed are concerned about companies being used in coercion by hostile countries as a means of pressuring their home governments. So what does that mean? If you are a company and you can become a target of a country wishing to harm another country by using you, so this is not news. It's to companies or indeed to many citizens. It's just, I think our governments have to be straight with them, and then that may cause some panic initially, but then people say, well, I better get prepared. I better think about these things, because there is a real risk that it will happen in my country or where I live, and that's what the Latvians are doing so well.
So we are getting outstanding questions from listeners, and I want to go in the next one to both Mark Montgomery and Gidrimas. And the question is, the gray zone also includes use of and support to proxies and militia groups. How do the US and NATO deter the use of proxy forces? What tools do we have? Deterrence is predicated on a perception of a credible threat or scope of our response. How do we scope our response to avoid the very escalation we are hoping to deter? Mark, let's hear from you first.
Sure, thanks. And first, I do want to say one quick thing, agreeing completely with the last three speakers about the resilience of the Ukrainians. I would say this: the Baltic states, I found during the time when I worked with their militaries, have that same level of resilience and building of a citizen army, citizen response forces. The only problem, of course, is all 6 Baltic states added up together is just a shade over 6 million people. And even the most poorly executed Russian campaign is going to have a lot more success against, a country with 2 million or a group of countries with 6 million. So that should be a concern for all of us. How you deal with proxies is really challenging. But I would also say the key there is the discipline and leadership that the Western countries have to take in holding the country that abets, supports, and harbors the proxies accountable. So a perfect example of this is the ransomware as a service providers that hit Colonial and other U.S. Companies. We attempted to attack just the ransomware as a service providers and try to claw back the ransomware and the cryptocurrency that have been taken. President Biden did challenge President Putin and said, you need to knock this off. But I had not seen sanctions based on proxy actions only. And I think that's probably the next step is that you say to a country, they are doing this on your behalf or at your behest. And maybe we have some other intelligence that proves that you're even kind of naming the target sets. We're going to hold you accountable. Now, obviously, you have to have tools to do that. So that's a limited number of countries that have the economic tools to hold another country accountable. But the United States, fortunately, is in that position. And we should do that on behalf of ourselves and our European partners and work with our European partners so we do it together. We all know that sanctions by the United States have effect. Sanctions by the United States and Europe have a multiplying effect. And we just need to hold the people who harbor those proxies accountable.
Thank you. Assistant Secretary General Jeglinskas, excuse me. Please, does it look any different from a NATO perspective?
No, I think it's fully concur here with Mark. I think it's about really attributing that proxy to the right state level actor, and I think in this regard, obviously, for example, in cyber warfare, that is very hard. It's very hard to attribute to the the proper, even find these actors and then actually attribute to certain state level entities. But I think here the collaboration, this is what I think NATO does well. We rely on, because we don't have our own intelligence, we rely on different nations providing this support, and I think that's where NATO as a forum of both venting and attributing and agreeing on what can be done can be useful.
So we have several questions that focus on the different ways China and Russia use gray zone warfare. And I want to read a little bit of it, and Elisabeth, ask you to respond. So it seems Russia's long-term strategic aim was to neutralize the West through gray zone aggression as a shaping operation, setting the conditions for the kinetic incursion we now see, which was clearly a miscalculation. But China, on the other hand, seems to be playing a longer game with suppression of the US as its immediate strategic aim and ultimately neutralization of US influence and capability in Asia. It seems Putin's actions could delay, if not derail, their timetable or their overall strategy. How do you respond to that, Elisabeth?
Thank you, Kori. And I just received a message or a reminder saying I should show the book. So I'll show the book and then answer your question. And I love this art here with a hand stopping the aggression, which is what we're aiming for. So if I can start with China. So what do we do as open societies set up to engage with other open societies, including societies that are opening and that we hope will become fully open, if they don't pursue that path and if they only take advantage of our openness to aid their own progress? And that's the challenge that we have with China. It's really China's efforts to maximize or accelerate its economic performance to our detriment. And so just one area, there are many that could be highlighted, but for example, science and technology innovation, which is really the engine of Western economic growth. And we have spent generations investing in academic research that has led us to where we are today, where we innovate, create fantastic products, technology, with companies that make money that powers our economies. And so what do we do when, for example, a country such as China takes advantage of our science and technology innovation, both in the university setting and in the startup setting, to get our best ideas and essentially cut short the enormous investment that is required for a country to make that leap, and thus instead China does so using our ideas, our companies. And there is no answer to it, because this, like so many other areas of gray zone aggression, looks like just a hustle and bustle of globalization, and it's very hard to identify, well, is this just a little bit annoying, or is it something that we clearly need to address? And like so many other areas, if we address it in essence harms globalization. So that's where we are today. But on that note, I think the reason that China isn't isn't behaving very menacingly vis-a-vis the West is militarily, is that they are so successful in this other area in the gray zone, and doing extremely well economically as a result of it, which is why I think it's so important to involve citizens and the wider society, so that they are aware of this happening and can, for example, think twice before selling their companies to a Chinese entity, before engaging in sensitive research without checking their academic partners properly. But gray zone aggression really is geopolitical gaslighting. You think you're noticing something, but you're not sure whether it's in your head or it's real, and the other side can tell you it's just in your head. So we have to trust ourselves and say, this is happening, and what are we going to do?
That's a wonderful summary of the main thrust of the book as well. And I want to add to that one of the reasons our adversaries have been pushed to gray zone warfare is because they lack confidence they can achieve their aims through the use of military force. And that is a great tribute to the work of the countries of the NATO alliance and America's allies elsewhere, that we maintain military forces strong enough to protect our societies. Now, I see Giannis disagreeing with this, so I'm going to give him a chance. And in general, I would like, in our last 3 minutes, for each of our panelists to give one parting shot. What are we still missing about gray zone warfare, or something we should do? Giannis, you first.
Yes, actually, I wanted to say exactly the same, and that I think is the biggest misperception about gray zone, that we try to separate it from conventional or from the military force, because I think that is one general strategy where you use, and as Sun Tzu said, the greatest victory is where no battles are fought. Because you try to basically influence your enemy, brain, economy, and corruption, many other things. If it doesn't work, you go for military, and that's what happened in Ukraine. Therefore, we have to understand that this is the one comprehensive strategy, and we deal in our biggest mistake. Usually we try to separate and put nuclear on the pillow, then don't give money for defense, and then pretend that everything is fine, and that is the biggest mistake.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate that perspective. Mark Montgomery.
You know, if one last thought is that I don't think China would have made this mistake Russia did, and I think they're probably harmed by Russia's actions here in Ukraine, going kinetic. China has been running a solid game against the United States and its Asian allies and the Europeans for the last decade. And we talk about grabbing the islands, but you can also think about the intellectual property theft they've conducted against American and European countries that come into joint ventures in China, and the way they strong arm that and are able to steal that intellectual property and then begin a manufacturing process on their own. So, the defender's dilemma is going to continue. And even after this Russia-Ukraine conflict ends.
Thank you, Mark. Gidrimas, a closing thought.
Well, to me, as a kind of former policymaker, I think it's the key question is, how do we respond? How do we deal with this? And I think in many governments, as we see that across NATO and as our allies, is that how do we make decisions? Who's responsible for that at the governmental level? Oftentimes, there's never a resilience minister. Often things flow into the top to the prime minister or somebody. But I think here is key, whether that the nations need to think about, because these issues cross ministries. So it's not just MODs, not just MFA, not just Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Transportation. It's really, it's a very complex issue. And I think here we all need to think about whether sort of deputy prime minister level positions that sort of combine a lot of these ministers that are able to really tackle these issues, because this is whole of government approach that's required, and I think that's something probably that needs to evolve in our democratic societies.
Excellent. Elisabeth, you get the last word, my friend.
Thank you. So the most important part is, I think, that in military defense, not everybody can contribute to military defense, but everybody can contribute to gray zone defense, and everybody has a role to play. And for governments, that means that they have the opportunity to innovate in a way that they haven't been able to innovate in the past. And if I can just highlight one thing, the Czech Republic, just like that, went ahead and started gray zone exercises involving leading Czech companies and the armed forces. Why not? They are doing it. So the innovation is happening in countries like Latvia, in countries like the Czech Republic, and others can learn from them. That's a great thing about having friends, and that's how we can keep our country safe.
An excellent note to end on. My friends, thank you very much for sharing your time and your expertise this morning as we celebrate and learn from the work of our valued colleague, Elisabeth Braw, and her outstanding new book, The Defender's Dilemma. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.